Hello, welcome to the Psychology of Good and Evil. This is September 24th lecture. Today we'll be exploring moral values. Researchers from multiple disciplines have attempted to explain some apparent contradictions about human morality. Human beings are often selfish, and yet they know themselves as moral people with moral motivations. And this moral motivation seems universal. Across the world and across various religions, people wish to do good and be good. Yet we see some striking cultural variability in what counts as moral or the right thing to do. Given these apparent contradictions about humankind, is there a universal recipe for a moral value? What counts as a moral value? When it comes to understanding moral motivations, the historic trajectory in moral psychology and moral philosophy, it shows us that morality has typically been considered a progressive march toward greater sensitivity about harm and injustice. A prominent account that put its focus on harm and injustice as central to morality is Elliot Turiel's. Turiel's influential psychological investigation of morality defined morality as, quote, prescriptive judgments of justice, rights, and welfare pertaining to how people ought to relate to each other. The inspiration for Turiel's work was the philosophical literature on the distinction between morality and convention. If morality is prescriptive judgments of justice, rights, and welfare pertaining to how people ought to relate to each other, conventions are acceptable social behaviors. On this view, non-moral social convention issues are things like being patriotic, chastity, deference to authority. This moral versus conventional distinction is the core of Turiel's theory. With his associates, he developed an experimental paradigm that became known as the moral conventional task. In order to understand what makes morality different from convention. In this moral conventional task, participants answer probe questions about a series of behaviors. The behaviors represent transgressions of prototypical moral rules and prototypical conventional rules. These probe questions were designed to determine some features that Turiel believed were crucial to the moral conventional difference. They examined, first, whether the participants considered the transgression to be wrong, the action, and if so, how serious it was. How serious was the wrongness? Second, whether the participants thought that the wrongness of the transgression was authority dependent. And this is an important distinction, and it means that he wants to know, do people consider this transgression to be wrong, even if they're told by an authority figure that it's right? For example, a participant who has said that a specific act is wrong might be asked, well, what if the teacher said there is no rule in this school against that? Would it be right to do it then? Alongside these questions about seriousness of the wrongness and authority dependence, they also examined whether participants thought the rule was general in scope, meaning does it apply to everyone everywhere, or is it limited to a range of people in a restricted set of circumstances? And fourth, finally, the questions probed how the participants justified the rules about that transgression or that action. Did they invoke harm, justice, rights when they were justifying their answer? Or did they invoke other factors like preferences or practical considerations? Using these probe questions, Turiel was able to determine whether transgression and rules against it were relevant to morality or were conventional. Turiel observed that there was a signature moral profile response pattern. This signature profile was that a moral transgression was seriously wrong. It was wrong, and that wrongness was serious. Its wrongness did not depend on authority figures. It was authority independent. It was wrong everywhere, in all circumstances. So it was general in scope, the wrongness. And the reason that it was wrong was that it was harmful or unjust or it violated someone's rights. Prototypical moral transgressions include a child pushing another child off a swing or a person hitting another person. By contrast, the profile for conventional transgressions was that they were considered less serious. Their wrongness was authority dependent. They were only wrong in some conditions. And they weren't considered wrong because someone was hurt or treated unfairly or had their rights violated. Prototypical conventional transgressions include someone talking out of turn in a class or at a presentation when they've not been called on, or someone wearing the clothing that's typically worn by someone of a different gender. Over the last 30 years of research, this pattern of results has been found in a very diverse range of participants. For example, participants of different ages, young children at least as early as 3.5 years old, grade school children, high school students, university students, and adults. The pattern has been observed in participants of different nationalities and cultures, including participants in China and Korea, Nigeria and India, Brazil, Israel, and the Virgin Islands. And researchers have looked at this distinction in participants of different religions and found it in Roman Catholic, Amish and Mennonite, Dutch Reformed, and conservative Jewish participants. On the basis of these findings, some have concluded that moral rules are a natural kind with the properties that were explored in that moral conventional task. Moral rules should typically involve harm or rights violation. They should be general in scope. They should refer to transgressions as wrong everywhere, not just locally. The wrongness should not be authority dependent. And the violation is more serious than in the case of conventional transgressions. And parallel arguments are made for conventional rules as natural kinds. Conventional rules do not involve harm or rights violations. They're not general in scope. They vary locally. And they're authority dependent at times. Violations are also less serious than in the case of moral rules. But wait, the moral conventional distinction does not always hold. Many studies have found that in many societies, including our own, transgressions that do not involve harm or justice or rights do not evoke that response pattern typical of conventional transgressions. Rather, such transgressions evoke one or more of the signature moral responses, even though they're not about harm, justice, or rights. These transgressions are deemed very serious, wrong everywhere, and wrong even if you're following orders. Perhaps the most famous of these studies is a study by Jonathan Haidt, and this used a really colorful range of non-harm transgressions, including a vignette involving a family eating the deceased family dog, or cleaning a toilet bowl with the national flag. And what they found was that a segment of participants, including low SES participants in the US and in Brazil, they actually judged these non-harm transgressions to be authority independent and generally applicable, their wrongness. And US conservatives also showed this pattern of responses, and there'll be more on that later. Importantly, if some people believe that these transgressions that other people consider to be conventional, distressing, but not necessarily moral, and some people consider them to have the qualities of moral transgressions, then this is a direct challenge to Turiel's model. Okay, here's a question to take a pause and to test yourself to see if you're on track. Turiel's influential research used the moral conventional task to determine whether and how transgressions involving harm, injustice, and rights violations differed from transgressions involving violating social norms. Which of the following characteristics is not part of the signature moral response pattern? 1. The transgression is considered seriously wrong. 2. The transgression is considered wrong in all situations. 3. The transgression is considered wrong even if commanded by an authority. Or 4. The transgression is considered worthy of serious punishment.